chat a little bit about, I mean, there's big parts of the contract that some people maybe don't always understand. And one of those, I think, really is this kind of the seller disclosure statement. What exactly is it, and what's it meant to do?
Seller's disclosure statements are really a critical piece of buying and selling real estate in Washington. I'm not sure about other states, but this is the state basically says, okay, inspections are only going to discover so much, but the owner, if they live there for any length of time, has a lot larger body of working knowledge that they need to pass on to the buyer. This is the primary recourse to keep the buyer from getting burned and keep these things from going to court if they're handled correctly.
And so really it comes down to a seller who's lived in a house for 10 years or 5 years or whatever, probably knows about all the squeaks and all the leaks and all the different pieces of the house that are slowly falling apart.
Yeah,
or have fallen apart.
Exactly. There are sellers who don't know every last thing about a property, and the state handles that by allowing a seller to answer a question with "don't know." So, for example, it will say, "Has the basement ever flooded or leaked?" The seller can say yes, no, or don't know. Quite often with a flood, you would know, but there are some more subtle things like, does the property contain fill material? Well, unless you're a contractor or you had major renovations done to your yard, you wouldn't know the answer to that question. So you can check don't know, but you want to use that only when it really applies.
Sure. So when somebody goes about going through this, I mean, how does somebody know? I mean, what if the questions are answered accurately from the buyer's side? It would seem like this would be an easy way to deceive a little bit. How do you know if you're getting full disclosure about, all the material facts really about a property?
The only way you can really know that usually is by living in the house. So keep in mind, if a question that was answered on that disclosure form by the seller said, no, I don't know of flaw X, and then after living in the house, you discover not only flaw X, but you discover the fact that the seller would have known about this. Now the fact that that seller failed to disclose, that will be your primary recourse in court after closing.
Okay. Well, let's get into that, too, because I think that's going to be really important is, okay, what recourse does somebody have? But what types of questions should they expect to see? I mean, when a buyer is looking at this or a seller is looking to sell a house, what type of disclosure should they be expected to actually, I guess, have?
Well, there's a couple of different disclosure forms. One is for vacant land, and the one we see most often is the one that covers residential and condo sales, both on the same form. So, and that also, I need to mention the details that there are some parts of the disclosure form that do not apply. For example, it'll say, does this property have irrigation rights? You would put NA, non-applicable. Or does the property have a homeowners association? And if you're a residential property, you don't have an HOA,
Sure.
So you put NA on that as well.
Okay. So a lot of these questions, I mean, they have a lot to do with a huge scope of the property.
Yeah, they cover about as much as you can think of. They do cover legal issues, too, discussions about surveys, boundary rights, easement, joint access, anything like that. But mostly it covers the physical state of the property.
The roof, flooded basements. You mentioned, what are some of the other questions that are on there?
It will ask, does the property have any wood-burning appliances? Do they meet
which you should probably know,
codes?
right, if you have wood-burning appliances?
Stuff like that. And any included systems, they have flaws. Electrical system, plumbing system, security system, on down the line. The state's really trying to make sure that nothing is left, no stone's left unturned.
Sure, makes sense. Michael, are there exceptions to these rules? I mean, if you said if somebody doesn't maybe know they don't have to answer, it would seem like there'd be a lot of these that maybe your typical homeowner wouldn't even have any idea about.
Yeah, I mean, if the homeowner is selling the property, there's stuff that they won't know about, but then there's also exceptions to having to fill this form out, and they're limited. But let's say a bank has foreclosed on a property now that it's an REO. This lender has no ideas the flaws on this asset, so they typically waive this form. Typically, a new construction.
The bank's probably a representative from the bank has probably never even been into the house.
No, they're just looking at a spreadsheet.
Right.
And it's going, okay, there's this, 2,000 square foot fiasco out in West Seattle. What are we going to do with it?
The fiasco house. So then I guess, so that's one, but bank-owned property, banks aren't going to be expected to fill this out because they're not going to know anything about the house.
Another example you'll see a lot are estate sales. So all that working knowledge passed on with the deceased. The next of kin rarely have true working knowledge of the property. So they may fill out a limited disclosure, but it's known by all parties that, hey, basically, that basement flood that old Joe took care of 20 years ago, no one knows about that.
Sure. Makes a lot of sense. Are there big impacts on the seller? I mean, we talked a little bit about the recourse, but it would seem that, you fill this thing out, maybe you sign the bottom. And I know in the past there have been, there's often times where maybe this has slid under the carpet, or slid under the rug, some of the maybe fraudulent disclosures on this. What is going on now with fraudulent disclosures?
Basically, the buyer can really hold the seller's feet to the fire. And as the state makes all of us brokers say, I'm not an attorney. If you need legal advice, go to an attorney. But I do know that if you're a seller and you commit fraud, you're in a world of trouble because you signed this statement saying this is true to the best of your knowledge. So as a seller, look, do not worry about freaking out a buyer by disclosing some things that happen with the house. In fact, you will probably encourage the buyer by the fact you're being forthright. The buyer will say, hey, look, they disclosed some flaws. A flaw happened in 2005. It was fixed in 2006. This is the type of homeowner I want to buy from.
Right. So, a leaky roof 5 years ago now that has a new roof is not going to scare anybody.
Exactly. That's what I would want to see if I'm buying a home. The ones that make me suspicious, you have an old, let's say, 1920s home, and this person's lived there for 20 years, and there's nothing on that seller's disclosure form. That is BS. Excuse me. That is
perfect.
BS.
Yeah, no kidding. Michael Busacca joins us here. Michael, so when people are out there and I guess this perception of what somebody could be fearful of, especially when it's a buyer, I guess on the flip side, which maybe people don't think about is, well, the buyer might actually think that if a house is well maintained and the seller is out trying to find these problems and then fixing them, that's a good thing.
Yeah, it's definitely a good thing. Homes have problems. Sorry, folks. The problem-free home doesn't exist. Even if you buy a brand new Buchan home, it's an outstanding structure. But over time, problems will arise. Flashing fails, little leaks develop, siding cracks and splits. You have to paint it. You have to seal it. It's basically one of the biggest things you want to watch out for as a home buyer and as somebody reviewing a seller's disclosure form is anything involving water penetration. Because that's when a little subtle thing, like let's say you have a stucco house. You shouldn't have one in the Northwest, but if you do, a little hairline crack, that could allow thousands of dollars worth of moisture damage that you wouldn't see in an inspection. Mm-hmm. You wouldn't see until you tore that apart and saw black mold everywhere.
Underneath the crack of a stucco house. People have stucco houses. There's some stucco houses around in our neighborhood.
Yeah,
it's like you think you're in California. Of course, I live in Kirkland, right, which has palm trees everywhere too. So yeah. A lot of people in Kirkland do think they live in California. Michael, so talk about the recourse. Talk about if somebody feels like they have been lied to or they've failed to disclose. What is the recourse a buyer has?
Well, at that point, you purchased a home, you moved in, you now can't change anything on the contract like you would have been able to during the contract. You could have negotiated for an adjustment, price adjustment, seller credit for that flaw. Now you need to go get an expert to quantify the damage. You need to have siding contractor, roofing contractor, whoever come out and say, okay, this is exactly how much this will cost to fix. And then you need to go sit down with an attorney. And the attorney will say, hey, this is exactly how we can pursue this seller. And just keep in mind that it really comes down to if the seller's disclosure form asks, do you know of flaw X? And the seller checks the box, no, now they're in a bind. If they check the box, don't know, that might have been a BS answer, but they have now dodged their responsibility.
So in some ways, and I don't want to give sellers ideas, could you just mark don't know to everything?
I helped one person buy a condo on Queen Anne, and the seller was an attorney, and he just barely checked don't know and everything. And I think that is just absolutely a cop-out.
It could be a cop-out, but in some ways, you're like, look, I don't know. I don't remember. I don't recall.
Yeah, that's...
And this isn't what you want to hear, but it just seems that would be... It's a cop-out, and then maybe that's just the seller you don't want to buy from.
Exactly. You may have to come down and press the seller for that. Say, look, this is the most suspicious thing I've ever seen. Mm-hmm. Therefore, we are not pursuing this property until you decide to be forthright.
Yeah. Any other big impacts people should be aware of?
You should you should really be aware of the fact that the longer a person is in a house, the more they're going to have to know, and the more you really need to not only have a great inspector, but you need to ask for additional inspections too. You need to come out and literally go through every flaw the inspector can find, do your detective work on that, and then, reconcile. Don't be afraid to come back to the seller and go, look, there was rats infested in this attic. I just saw that in a house I sold in Leshai. How could you not know about this? How could you be unaware of this flaw? So feel free to come back and press the seller after, thorough investigation of the property to come and maybe adjust that.
Yeah.